The all-university celebration for this year has been strengthening families to become the best, and that's put on through the Family of Consumer Sciences. So welcome, we're glad you're here. We're also funded by GSB, by the way. Can't forget that. My name is Jill Watson. I'm a student member on the National Affairs Committee. And this morning I'd like to introduce you to Peter Martin. Mr. Martin is a professor and director of the gerontology program here at Iowa State University. He studied psychology at Wartburg College to obtain his undergraduate degree. Went on from there to the University of Bonn in West Germany and received his doctorate in psychology. He returned then to the United States and received his PhD in Human Development and Family Studies from Pennsylvania State University. He's a co-author of numerous books and scores of journal publications. Mr. Martin has given presentations across the country and around the world. His specialty is aging and the aged in every aspect from physical health to gambling habits. Today, Mr. Martin takes a look at today's society and asks, what does great-grandma think about this? Please welcome Mr. Peter Martin.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction and for inviting me to speak in this lecture series. I do want to talk a little bit today about a national affair or national movement. Certainly the topic that I'm most interested in, older people. And it's certainly fitting also that we talk about this in the context of strengthening families. As you think about families, you often think about parents and children, parents with young children, midlife parents with adolescent children, all important topics. Every once in a while we hear about grandparents, intergenerational relationships, the relationship between grandparents and grandchildren. But we almost never hear anything about the next generation, the great-grandparents. And I must confess, although I've worked with very old people for a long time, I haven't spent as much time talking about great-grandparents as I should have. And so this is a welcome opportunity for me to think a little bit more about this very old generation within the families. But let's start with the national movement first and what is happening in this country and, as a matter of fact, all over the world. There's really a major change that we are going to get much more acquainted with during the 21st century. And that is the tremendous increase of what we call the oldest old, people who are 85 years and older. Currently, we have about 4.4 million people in this country who are 85 years and older. And that is already a substantial number. But we are expecting truly a revolution in this age group that is the fastest growing in this country. By the year 2040, by some estimates, by the year 2040, we expect that 40 million people in this country, 40 million people in this country will be 85 years and older. So almost a tenfold increase in just 40 years. And you just think about that for a moment. Right now we have 280 million people in the United States, a lot of people, and we'll gain some over the next 40 years, I'm sure. But 40 million, that is a lot of people that are 85 years and older. Remember, we're not talking about the 60-year-olds. We are talking about the very old. And I'm talking often to my demographer friends, and they tell me, in the past, we have consistently underestimated the number of people in the old age bracket, so it may even be more than that. Now, one subgroup of the oldest old is what we call centenarians, people who are 100 years and older. And there, too, you may notice that a dramatic increase that we'll be expecting sometime happening during this century. Currently, we have 72,000 people in the United States who are 100 years and older. That's the best estimate that we have. And this number will steadily increase. But as we reach about 2035, 2040, we're beginning to see another dramatic increase in the number of people that are 100 years and older. We're expecting more than 830,000 people in the United States will be 100 years and older. Why this dramatic shift at the mid-century? Well, it's the baby boomers that we can expect to turn 100 years in 2046 first, and then following on from there. So dramatic increase. The increase in the oldest old, 85 plus or centenarians, is not equally distributed in our population, however. If you look at the gender distribution, we all know that women have a much better chance getting older than men. But that even gets more accentuated as you move to the very old. At age 100, 83% currently of the centenarian population is female. And only 16.7% are male. It's a lot of great-grandmas, obviously, that we have here as compared to great-grandpas. So we need to be sensitive to the issue of gender differences. Many people, as a matter of fact, have said that the study of the oldest old, at least as it stands now, is a women's issue. It's a study of women, very old women, and a lot of the special issues that go along with gender and gender differences. But I also emphasize that as much as gender is important to look at, ethnic differences are also important to look at, and particularly as we move across this next century. Right now, 77.8% of all centenarians in this country are white, 12.5% are black, and 5.6% are Hispanic. That is going to change. The makeup, the distribution, the percentages of people falling into the age group of the very old is going to change, so that by the year 2050, only half of that population will be white or Caucasian. We have about the same percentage of African Americans, but we will see a major increase in the Hispanic population. Just about 20% of all the very old will be of Hispanic origin. Now, let's move from the national level to the Iowa level. Let's move to Iowa and see where we stand with regard to the oldest old right now. In Iowa, currently, we have 35,000 people in the age group between 85 and 89. We have about 15,000 people in Iowa who are between 90 and 94. We have about 4,500 people in Iowa who are between 95 and 99 years old. These are census data coming, however, from 1990, so we'll have to update them as soon as we get the new census data. A little bit more than 700 people in the state of Iowa who are 100 years and older. So again, I think I've been trying to make the case that we have more and more very old people is the fastest segment of our population, and we ought to pay more attention to this age group. Much of what we know in gerontology from research studies in our textbooks comes and is concerned with people that are in their 60s and 70s. And why that is important knowledge to have, and why we want to know what is life like when you're 60 or 70, there's almost no knowledge whatsoever that we have about people in their 80s, 90s, or even 100s. So only very, very few studies. So when I came to Iowa State in the early 90s, I thought it might be a good idea to study the oldest old, because not only do we have a national movement of people in the United States who tend to get older and older, and more people in the oldest old age group, Iowa ranks number one in the nation with regard to the percentage of people that are 85 years and older. We have the highest concentration of any state in the United States who are in this age group of the oldest old. Well, why is this? There's some speculation of why people tend to get so old in Iowa. I believe it was Senator Harkin who once said, doesn't surprise him that people live so long here in Iowa because we are frozen half the year. And I can obviously sympathize with that this winter, as we have perhaps a colder winter than normal. Now, there is actually, it's not just a funny comment, there is some biological research indicating that the metabolic rate in northern states is slower than in southern states because of the temperature and the climate, and that may indeed have something to do with longevity. And this is not only true for the United States, certainly also for Europe. The country that has the highest longevity other than Japan is Sweden, also a northern country, Scandinavian country certainly. So we'll have to look at that. I'm not going to talk about longevity here today, that's not my topic, but it is what really makes Iowa unique as a state with a large concentration of very old people. I feel that we really have a chance here not only to study longevity and to study family life, as I'm going to talk about a little bit today, of these very old people, but also with regard to policies. How are we adjusting to a much larger percentage of very old people? Because what we are experiencing here in Iowa today, other states will experience tomorrow. And so I think it is a very, very relevant topic indeed. So we started in the early 90s with what we call the Iowa Oldest Old study, and my co-principal investigators on this are Chris Cook, who has an interest in housing and aging, and Joyce Mercier, who has long had an interest in later life families. The purpose of the Iowa Oldest Old study is to assess developmental changes in individual and family resources for very old people, and we define them as 90 plus. 85 wasn't old enough for us, so we decided we'll start with 90. We wanted to not only look at people who are 90 years and older, we also wanted to compare people who are in institutional care facilities, nursing homes for the most part, and compare them to those who still live in their own homes. Because something that I had learned from my earlier involvement in the Georgia centenarian study, I was a faculty member at the University of Georgia, was that a surprising number of centenarians lived in their own homes. But 40% of our sample in Georgia did. So I thought, well, we ought to look more at the comparison between what it is like when you are 90 or 100 and you live in a nursing home as compared to living in your own home. So that was the general objective of our study. We started out looking at 50 nonagenarians, that is people that are in their 90s, from 90 to 100, and we looked at 50 people who are centenarians. And the reason for that was simply to look, does it make any difference? I mean, everybody talks about 100-year-olds. That's quite an achievement, as we probably all would agree, at least in age. And we were wondering, well, is life different when you're 100 from when you're 90? And so we wanted to specifically compare these two age groups. And then, as I said, we collected our data, we contacted people purposefully so that we would have 50% of our sample reside in the community, in their own homes, and then the other 50% who would reside in care facilities. And then the other important aspect of our study that we are still working on is we wanted to follow these people every year. We wanted to go back and interview them every year, at least once during the academic year. And I'm happy to tell you our study is not finished yet. We have some people who have participated in our interviews 8 times in a row, every year. They wonder why we would be coming back. They enjoy talking to us. But we have some very nice, at least on the individual level, some very nice longitudinal data, because we were interested to see what changes over time as people move along the 90s and the 100s. We focused on a number of areas that we were interested in. One was what we call the family of origin. We wanted to go way back. We thought, here we have people who have lived a very, very long life. There's got to be something special about these people, and they can still tell us something about what life was like when they were children, 80, 90, 100 years ago. There's an African proverb that says when an old person dies, it's like a library burns in the community. And that's often how I feel about it when we talk with our very old people. They are the holder of knowledge, of traditions in the community that they may have lived in for a long, long time. And so we went back way into their childhood. And some of our centenarians and nonagenarians like that, and others wondered why we could be possibly interested in something that happened 80 or 90 years ago. We're also interested in life events. What sorts of experiences have these people had throughout their whole lives? Childhood, certainly, adolescence, young adulthood, midlife. We really try to cover the whole lifespan and important events and experiences, including historical experiences, experiencing the Great Depression, experiencing both world wars, and so forth and so on. Essentially, really covering the 20th century with them. We were interested in how much control you feel you have when you're 90 or 100. What is it like to be 100? We consider this to be a personal resource, that even when things start failing, the bottom line question may still be, am I in control of my life or not? And so that sort of goes through our whole study. One of the major aspects that we were certainly interested in is the level of family support. As perhaps your health is failing, your functional health may also be failing, vision, hearing, and so forth and so on, you may have to rely more on family support. And so family support and family relationships was certainly an important aspect in our study. And then with my prior background, which is in mental health and aging, we're also interested in issues of mental health, issues of depression, loneliness, issues of cognitive impairment. Those are the things that people worry about most when they move from the 60s to the 70s and to the 80s. So we thought, well, we better find out what it looks like and how these people feel about possible changes here. And of course, health. Now, we don't have a physician on our staff yet, I should say. And so we're talking about subjective health, health as it is reported by the oldest old themselves. Now, I don't have time to talk about all these issues today. That's why, because of the theme on strengthening families, I'm going to exclusively, or primarily I should say, focus on family support and look at family relationships as we find them in the very old. And we are agreeing with the framework that was put forth by Vern Bengtson and others in the 1980s and 1990s that essentially indicated family support and family relationships across the lifespan, not just for the oldest old, but across the lifespan, can be divided in a number of components. And it is 4 components that we are looking at here when we talk about families. First of all, what we call, or what Bengtson calls, structural solidarity. Well, structural solidarity primarily relates to the number of children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren you might have. If you don't have any children, or if you don't have any grandchildren, you can't get any support from grandchildren. And so, there's got to be what we call an opportunity structure. You must have the opportunity to engage with family members. And also geographic proximity, although I'm not going to talk much about it today, but there's obviously going to be a difference whether you live with your great-grandchildren in the same town, in a perhaps rural environment, as compared to having the next great-grandchildren in California or New York. So all of those are structural questions. The family structure must be there for you to interact and to have family relationships and family support. The second one is what Vern Bengtson calls intergenerational affect or sentiment. The closeness between relationships, loving, trusting relationships, respecting each other, all of that goes into important relationships. And it is one of the hallmarks of a very well-functioning relationship. So certainly we looked at intergenerational affect, how close people, generations, feel to each other. Intergenerational contact, that relates sort of more to the quantitative aspect. How often do you see each other? How often do you do things together as a family, as generations? And again, these questions have all been asked between older adults in their 60s and their children and grandchildren, but they really have not, to a great extent, been asked for an age group that is in their 80s, 90s, and 100s. And then finally, intergenerational help. Obviously, one of the aspects that I was interested and concerned about is to know to what degree do these generations help each other across time, and that could be tangible support, such as running errands, helping with the finances, and so forth and so on. But it could also be direct financial support from one generation to the next. I'm going to talk about all those 4 aspects very briefly with data from our Iowa Oldest Old and ask the question, well, what about structural solidarity? What about intergenerational affect? What about intergenerational contact? And what about intergenerational help? So a little bit on all those 4 aspects. And rather than throwing a lot of numbers at you, I thought in this forum, I would also make sure that I let our very old people speak themselves. So you'll hear them, I think, very loud and clear as I move through these 4 very important family and intergenerational topics. The first one concerns structural solidarity, opportunity structures, having children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. Well, and the first surprise, perhaps, if you don't know this area very well, is that not everybody has children even. The mean number of children in our sample is 2.38, but focus on this first column in here, 0 children. It is the largest of all bars. More than 23% of our sample of very old people that are 90 or 100 years old has no children. Has no children. That is every 4th person. So when I'm going to talk about family support a little bit, keep in mind that I'm only going to talk about these people. Or am I? Well, no, I'm not. Because if you talk with a 90-year-old who does not have any child, and you ask, well, where do you get your support? They come up with all kinds of children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren that may not be part of their family, but nieces and nephews are just as important for that age group, as are sometimes friends that they have met somewhere, a helper, sometimes a nurse. And they say they are just like children to us. They are just like children or grandchildren to us. They have become very, very close to at least one person. There's almost nobody in our study who cannot identify anybody from a different generation as a close support person. So we consider them to be part of the family picture too, although again, they may not be a bloodline, lineage type child or grandchild. They are certainly there for the support and the affect and the intergenerational contact that we talked about early on. Well, I should have mentioned, of course, we have a few extreme cases on the other end too. There are some of ours in our sample who do report 4 or 5 children, and we have 2 members in our sample who reported to have 10 children. So this must come back. I don't know, I haven't looked carefully at this, but I would guess this is the old farm community where you had the support that way. Grandchildren. The mean number of grandchildren is 6.24, and again, the largest number of our sample does not have any grandchildren, about 25-26%, who may have waited for a long time and then just settled to the fact that it's going to happen. But look at the spread here. There's really no norm to say you have 3, 4, or 5 grandchildren. It goes all the way from having 1 grandchild all the way up to 50. And I had a hard time believing 50 grandchildren. It seemed like quite a bit to me. But since we go back every year, I looked at the next year, and again, it was the same 50 people that were mentioned. So I don't think it was a fluke. But there are some families who have a lot of grandchildren, and there are some who have very, very few. I think the pattern that we see here emerging is really one of diversity within very old people. There is no one pattern. There are many, many different patterns of intergenerational relationships. Some with very, very large families, and others with very, very few intergenerational linkages, as it were. I also must say, I should have said that already when I put up the number of children that we talked about. It is not uncommon, if you're 90 or 100, to lose a child before you go, or maybe even 2 or 3. It is one of the most dramatic events, obviously, because that's not how it's supposed to go. But just because your grandparents or your parents get to be very old doesn't mean that you do, or vice versa, that you think, well, I'm getting to be 95, so will the next generations. 50% of our sample of very old people who have children have lost at least one of their children. It is every second person. All of them in our Iowa sample have lost their spouse, have survived their spouse. But 50%, half of them, have lost a child. So certainly there is some vulnerability in here. You have to deal with these kinds of family changes as you transition into this very late life. Number of great-grandchildren. Now we're coming to the topic that I wanted to talk about. This is the group that we're focusing on. Here too, close to 30% don't have any great-grandchildren. And then we see a great number, a great spread of numbers on here, ranging from 1 great-grandchild all the way to, again, 49, 48. So there's a great difference. The mean is 5.9 for these for having great-grandchildren that you have contact with. Now, we're asking the question, what does great-grandma think about this? I've wondered ever since we agreed on that title what this is, and you might be wondering too. Well, we're wondering what do they think about, how do they feel about their families? And so this brings me to the second topic. After the structural solidarity, we're asking the question about intergenerational affect, sentiment, closeness. How much do we trust each other? How much do you respect each other? How much do you like each other? When you are 100 and your daughter is 75 and your grandchildren may be younger than that. Well, I promised you that I would let our great grandmas talk for themselves. Here's one participant who said this about her son. Dick is the best in the world. If I'm feeling kind of old, he comes to visit me. I'm all changed around. That's my son Dick. And that's what we hear a lot from these very old people. They do rely and they trust and they have a very, very close relationship to at least one person. Now, I must say, some people accuse those who are in intergenerational relations by being too optimistic about these relationships, because often older adults in these samples nominate somebody, and you may be biased to nominate somebody who you feel very, very close to. We did not do this in our study for that reason. We didn't want to overestimate the closeness of relationships, as it has been reported in the literature between 60-year-old people and their children and grandchildren. We asked, well, how many children do you have alive? And then if there was more than one, and you notice there was more than one for many of them, then we would randomly choose somebody who they felt closest to. So it is really a broader perspective. And you may want to keep that in mind as we move through some of those results in here, because we may be actually underestimating support in some cases. It may be higher with regard to a person that they would have nominated. Well, here's a person who says the same thing, a very high level of trust, but she puts a little twist on this. I like this response. That seems to be typical. He trusts me, she says. He thinks I'm a little stupid sometimes, but that's mutual. So, we have a group of older people who realize that, there's certain attitudes that we sometimes hold, and maybe our perspective of ageism that we've held about people who are in their 60s, and that we don't hold anymore, because if you're 60, you're not old. That's what these people will tell you. But maybe we have just moved a little bit on in the sliding scale, and now we regard somebody who's 90, 95, or 100 a little bit more feeble, having a little bit more problems, being stupid, so to speak. But they're saying, no, I'm not that way, and I hope you can respect me for that. Now, looking at our data, I want to show you a few of our data, obviously, too. This is the scale that we are using on intergenerational affect. And this is essentially our finding on it. Probably the most important thing to notice about this scale is that it ranges from, that's why I put it up there, from 13 to 78. So this is the whole range. These are the mean scores. A high score means very close relationships between generations. And a low score would mean very low, not so close relationships. Well, you know where we are. We are very much on top of the scale. Most of our participants indicate they have very, very close relationships to their children or grandchildren or great-grandchildren for that matter, but here the focus is on children. And as we have now looked at the first 3 waves of our data at year 1, going back at year 2, going back at year 3, we also notice that there's no change whatsoever. Well, maybe a year or 2 is not long enough to notice any change, but it stays right up there, right on the top. And also there's no difference as we move from time 1 to time 2 to time 3. There are really 3 points here that are so close you can't even distinguish them. And then this yellow line represents the survivors from one point to the next. So while we have 100 to start with, we have about 44 survivors who were still with us in the second year. And we have about 24 people who were still alive during the third measurement point, so after 2 years, coming back a third year. And you see, even among those groups, there is no difference in the level of closeness as we observe it. So the first point that I had tried to make is that people have contact to other generations, but they're not necessarily their children or grandchildren or great-grandchildren. Second point is the relationship and the level of closeness seems to be extremely high between these very old people and their adult children, at least from the perspective of the oldest generation. We know from other intergenerational research that the children might have given a slightly different perspective, but certainly the oldest generation, great-grandma, and she's the one who's talking here today, she says, I have very close relationships to my children. Now, what about contact? Remember, that was the third dimension we were interested in. How often do you do things together? How often do you see each other? How often do you talk on the phone? Well, actually, as a matter of fact, again, this is probably a very typical response to that question. Usually we have a telephone conversation every week, usually every Sunday night, once a week. So there is very regular contact. If anything, you might notice that usually there's something that's usual, there's a rhythm to this. And it is certainly something that is very, very regular. As a matter of fact, it's not just small talk that's going on, as you can hear in this example, where she is answering to the same question, talking with him. Oh, I don't make any move without. I talk to him first, because I'm getting forgetful and I depend on him. So here you see contact and the quality of the relationship going hand in hand. You're not just talking so you have talked on the phone again. You really do it because you depend on it as an older adult. It is a very, very important aspect in the intergenerational relationship, is to be in contact over the phone. And of course, our move in different technologies, whether it is phones and now with email, certainly makes this a lot easier. The surprise, however, comes if we look at the quantitative aspect of contact. We know that people think they have good contact and they do talk, but if you ask about the frequency, how often is it? How often do you do things together? Not only talking on the phone, but other activities. It is very, very low. The scale goes from 7 to 54, and you can see our mean is somewhere around 17, so at the very, very bottom. Now, why is this? This is obviously not because people don't want to call. Again, there are a lot of activities that are contained in the scale. Do you go shopping together? Do you go out to eat together? Do you go to church together? And it is those activities that really do not happen very, very frequently anymore, whether your daughter is in town or not. You are not getting out of your home, and probably not out of your home often enough, as this person would tell us if we ask great-grandma. She says, I don't go to any of those things, shopping, movies, trips, whatever the list is. They used to take me, but not now. They've all dropped me. They think I'm too old. I wish that they would invite me. So obviously, as these very old people speak, they have a different perspective. They're not going to ask every Sunday to be taken out. But there is still sort of a stereotype that if grandma or great-grandma is 95, well, who knows whether she's going to make it back alive, right? And that is an unnecessary assumption, because we know the average life expectancy of somebody in the 90s or 100 maybe 3 years. And so if you take her out today, she's not going to die. She's going to live at least 3 years. If she is healthy, if she is an active person, chances are it's going to be more than 3 years. So let's not discount it. Let's listen to this and say, well, maybe we could do a few more things. And some family members do. It's just not as much as you might think. And again, there comes the issue of control, of who decides what to do and who decides and how much help is needed. Much of the focus between generations, between great-grandma and younger generations is, we love and we care about each other, and that's understood. And then the next thing really is, well, we help when help is needed. Okay? And so intergenerational help is really the fourth aspect that I wanted to talk a little bit about. And I wanted to share again, to start us out, with a quote from another one of our participants. She says, intergenerational help, it's really good, except that he thinks now that I'm older that I haven't got good sense, and he's got to tell me what to do, when to do everything, except go to the bathroom, and I think he'd tell me that if he thought he could get away with it. Okay? A little feistiness, obviously, here among our oldest old, and I think that's probably a survivorship trait among them, but the message is clear. Yes, help, and help is needed. I don't think any one of our participants would negate that and say, I don't need any help. It's quite obvious that they may not be able to drive around as much, go shopping, and so forth and so on. But there's a fine line as a child. And again, remember, our children, if you are 100, our children are in their 70s. We're not talking about 20 or 40-year-old people. So there are, and this is a new phenomenon, here are the old taking care of the very old, if you wish. But some of the family dynamics that you experience will never go away. I remember interviewing an older person. She was in her 60s on a different project, and she was running the senior center. So we were sitting down there chatting and having a good time in the senior center. All of a sudden she looks at her watch and says, "Oh my gosh, it's 1 o'clock. I've got to go home. I told my mom I'd be home at 1 o'clock." Now she was 65 and her mother was in the 90s. So some of these patterns, again, do not go away, and isn't there something nice about that too, that she was thinking about that in that moment. If you look at the intergenerational help on the quantitative side, again, perhaps surprising that the level of help, and again, I've purposefully always given you the whole scale so you can see where on the scale it is. It's an 8-point scale from 0 to 8 all the way up there. And the range of help here is in the 2 to 3 range, so not really on the very top of this. Now this may have a lot to do with not wanting to be helped or wanting to be a burden if you don't need to. So our old people, as they are telling us the story, tell us, well, yeah, what this 2 to 3 represents is really several times a year. Several times a year, I may need help around the house or do something, but it is not daily help that we're experiencing in our sample. What is interesting here, however, is that for the first time we see the points, the lines not being very close together. Notice that our longitudinal sample, those who have survived over 3 years of measurement, have even a lower level of help. Well, that may represent the fact that if you are closer to death, as these people, this diamond here is and the yellow line is, you may need more help. And then family does come really to assist you and to help you over time. But overall, even for that group, the level of help quantitatively is lower than you might expect. Perhaps one other example of, well, let's have one great grandpa talk too. Would you allow me to do so? Mr. G, who describes, I think, quite nicely what this help might be or might look like. He lives in his own home and takes care of most of his business. And he talks about his daughter. She comes down from D every 2 weeks. Let me tell you what she does. Doctor's bills have to be paid, all my correspondence, maybe a letter has to be read. She writes all the checks and signs them. She spends most of her time taking care of business. So it's those little things that often fall into the helping category. We're not talking, and again, remember, I'm not looking at a primary caregiver here. It may be a primary caregiver, but it may be just some other family member as well. And to indicate to you that help is not only one-sided, that sometimes it goes the other direction too, although sometimes it may just be mutual, obviously, in here. Mrs. H says, well, it's mostly one-sided now, helping each other. He's helping me, he does all my shopping, he does lots of things around the house here that I can't do. But then another gentleman in here in our study who reflects on the issue of intergenerational help indicates, well, I usually pay her gas money to drive her down here and back. What I do now, each year I'm allowed to give them $10,000. Now, this is the gift amount that you can transfer to your children without having to pay taxes on it. So why? Since my wife died, I've started giving them, or I loan them money, and then I cancel it. They get a net of $10,000 a year. So there is, all of this is to show that there is intergenerational transfer with the very old, certainly, and we need to take that into consideration as well. I haven't talked much about the comparison between nonagenarians and centenarians. I've told you we look at people in their 90s and the 100s, and I haven't talked much about people who are in nursing homes and those who are not. And the reason is that really there aren't that many differences. Perhaps also a surprising fact with regard to family support or many of other measures. People in nursing homes or in institutional care facilities, when they're 90 or 100, by and large, do not get less support, don't feel any less close to children or nieces or nephews than people, older adults, very old adults, who live in their own homes. The level of closeness is equally high. By the way, also the level of depression or loneliness is no different in our study between those who live in care facilities and those who do not. And there aren't that many differences really between people who are 90 and 100. So that maybe we'll have to take the mystique away from the century mark and say it's only great if you're 100. People who in their 90s are often having just as important stories. One difference, however, that we did find is in intergenerational help, but I want to put it in the context, it's one of the very few differences that we find. There is more intergenerational help in people who are hundreds as compared to those who are in their 90s. And so maybe with regard to functional help and what we call often activities of daily living, the tasks that you're involved in your own home, there is more help needed as you are approaching the century mark. And certainly our longitudinal data seem to suggest that too. As we follow our people across the 90s, we notice that they will need more help as they get older. So what gets great-grandma into a good mood? Is it that you feel close to her? Is it that you visit her a lot, or is it that you help her a lot? Well, moving it one step further and to link our family variables to mental health variables, there's one result that I want to share with you today, and that is the prediction of morale, of mood, of feeling good or not so good. And we looked at all three aspects that I've talked about, actually all four, but let's leave it for now on the level for intergenerational affect, being close, loving, respect, trusting relationships. Intergenerational contact, how often do we see each other, how often do you call, how often do you do things together, and then helping behavior, how much do you help, and how much do you assist. And we do find if you look at all three of these variables as predictors, it is the helping behavior. It is the helping behavior that best predicts. Out of the family variables, the other variables that obviously play a role, but out of the family variables, it is the helping behavior that predicts an older person's, very old person's morale best. So in other words, the more help you receive from younger generations, the better you feel, the better morale you are in, is what we suggest to see in here in our family studies. Well, let me try to summarize, conclude, answer the original question that we really posed at the outset. What does great-grandma think about this? So we're coming to the finale and to the answers. Well, this is what I think she thinks. And I was hoping with our announcement that some people would bring their great-grandmas, but I'm not sure we've got any here. So I have to, we do. Oh, well, you can maybe tell us whether this is true or not. This is what I think. This is what I hear they're telling me. And sometimes they tell us, as researchers, a few other stories than they would tell their own family members. We're videotaping, with permission whenever permitted, our interviews. And most of our participants actually allow us to videotape quite readily. But every once in a while they'll say, "Stop that thing and I'll tell you." And whenever they do, I know they're telling us something that they wouldn't tell probably anybody else. So it makes it very, very special for us in the interview situation. And that's why we never use, obviously, names. And I've changed all the names and even some circumstances here as I tell about my sample, because otherwise you might be able to figure out which centenarian it might be. Well, this is what great-grandma thinks. She thinks her kids, her grandkids, her nieces and nephews are the best in the world. And this is another direct quote. Really, it is, they love to talk about their families. And again, it's not only their children, it's whoever they tend to feel very, very close to. Often it is children or grandchildren, great-grandchildren, nieces and nephews. So they do think they are the best in the world, and they probably are. Who would argue with that? Great-grandma clearly enjoys regular contact, visits, telephone contact with family members. And again, maybe she'd want to do even a little bit more than we're doing when we limit it to often, because of the vision that we have of what 95 might be like, maybe taking her out of once in a while would be a nice additional activity for her to get engaged in. And so the third thing that she might say is she would like to be invited perhaps a few times more often, so long as it is not too stressful. And I didn't tell you that part of the story. There's a fine line, and that makes it very difficult for children and grandchildren. I have a wonderful interview with a gentleman who reports on her daughter really almost urging him to attend a wedding in Colorado, and he is just not up to it. But he knows quite well the daughter's going to win out. I don't know how it turned out, whether he actually went to the wedding or not. But we were close before the wedding, we were interviewing him, and he focuses on that in much detail, saying, "I really don't want to go." And so what I'm really, and we have some other results from the Georgia study that indicates older people, much like everybody else, sort of can turn on or can turn off sociability. Sometimes we feel like we want to have a little more, and sometimes we just want to be left alone. And that certainly is true for our very old people. But the point is that we should not generalize from that. We shouldn't assume that just because she said no this time, she may say no from now on and forever. So we have to keep asking. We have to keep being involved. Just like we need to reestablish contact. We may make an appointment to visit, and for us it is always a visit first, our study participants. So we make an appointment to visit, and we may, as I did this morning, get a call to say, I really can't talk to you today, and can't you come some other day? And so then we have to reschedule. A little bit more flexibility is obviously asked here than we're used to when we study other people. What else does she say? Well, she depends on her family for help, but she certainly does not like to be told what to do. I've given you that impression from a few of our quotes and from our data. Then I think I've come across with the message that we get from a lot of our great-grandmas. And then finally, we do believe that great-grandma thinks that having a certain level of help is great, and it certainly makes her feel better. Maybe I should have put a second sentence right behind it in saying that so long as I'm not a burden. As again, a fine line in having contact and being helped and being in close contact with your family. It's another one to see that all that you are is perhaps just a burden to your family, and that is what you don't want to be. So that's all that I know what great-grandma thinks about it, but we are looking more into it. We're doing more studies. We're looking more at the longitudinal aspects of it as the study goes along, and I think we've learned